There was a vote, as everybody knows, over the weekend where Crimea, basically, if you take the number, uh, went 97% to rejoin Russia. Now, obviously, this could hardly be called a clean vote when you have troops occupying a place. You don't really have vote options. But I think there's no question that a lot of people in Crimea, Russian speakers, definitely feel more closely aligned with Russia. And there is a strategic split in Ukraine, which we've talked about. I mean, there's no question that, you know, it is a divided country, and one pull towards Western Europe, one pull towards Russia. President Obama and the European Union are promising to implement aggressive economic sanctions against Russia as a result of this latest vote. And look, I think there's a couple of just important things to have for framework here for this whole thing. And I've read a lot of things that people have sent me with a very pro-Russian perspective. And let me just make a couple of distinctions here. So one, I don't have a conspiratorial view of how this all went down. I think that in the first place, Europe definitely handled this very badly in terms of not even seeing what Yanukovych was doing. I mean, the whole root of this was they were about to sign a deal with Europe, a European agreement, and Putin swooped in with basically more money up front and less demands on the Ukrainian government. Yanukovych used that negotiation to pivot back and get a better deal from Russia, and that makes sense. Yanukovych has always been more aligned with Russia, and other leaders in Ukraine obviously more aligned with Europe. Now, it should be said that when we're talking from an electoral point of view, in terms of the political leaders, most of these Ukrainian leaders on both sides of this equation have tremendous corruption problems, and there is an oligarch problem in Ukraine. Clearly, that has dominated the politics and economics of this country on both sides of the equation. Now, the reason that a lot of activists in Ukraine, and let's not be ridiculous here. There are some very problematic parts of the Ukrainian uprising against Yanukovych, and we've been over them many times. And actually, even in the interview that I did with Professor Ariel, which people thought, I don't actually share all of his perspectives, but at any rate, I was sympathetic. I spent the first half of that interview really trying to define who are these groups we're worried about? Who are these fascist groups in Ukraine? And there's very real worries there. But as we know from Professor Blocky, who we interviewed during the protests, and we know from all sorts of reports during the protests from the ground, one of the leaders of the protests, a Muslim. There's Jewish members of the protests. There's socialists. There's liberals. It was a multi-sector uprising, and that was not all fabricated. And even someone like Professor Cohen, who is very critical, would acknowledge that in the beginning of those protests were very genuine. So that's reality. And the reason that people were up in arms, and the reason why if I was Ukrainian and I was forced to choose between all of these different options, I would lean towards Europe, is because, look, there's two aspects of European Union. One, there's no doubt that there is terrible austerity policies that Europe has been implementing on itself and on its southern zone, and it's detonating its union. And it's a horrible policy, and it's an atrocious policy, and it's written into the common market, and it's a massive mistake. On the other hand, the Europeans, when you go through that process, have about the highest standards right now you could ask for in the world. When Turkey was going through, when Turkey really thought they could join the EU, this is particularly 2003, 2004, 2005, they eliminated most, if not all, applications of the death penalty. They implemented all sorts of human rights reforms. You have to implement environmental standards. You have to implement anti-corruption standards. And these are real things. These are real benefits of being linked to the EU. That's why activists and some in Ukraine genuinely want a closer alignment with the EU. There are real tangible benefits to this. It does encourage a different type of government. Now, the EU has all sorts of problems, beginning with austerity, everything else. But if we're talking in real terms of geopolitical models out here to emulate, the EU is probably as good as you're going to find in this current environment. And that's not very good because this environment is not good. But it's the best you're going to find. Now, moving forward, I think there's no question. There's two other key points here. Other people have said, look, this is a rational, realist Russian response to Ukraine getting pulled out of its sphere of influence and to U.S. policies which, as distinct from EU agreements, the expansion of NATO since the collapse of the Soviet Union has undoubtedly been provocative to Russia and misleading. After the Russian understanding after the collapse of the Soviet Union was that we would not push NATO. But we have. We've pushed it through Poland. We've pushed it through the Baltic states. And clearly, as you get closer and closer to them, Russia's strategic calculation is this has to stop. This isn't acceptable anymore. Now, from the standpoint of this show and the way we usually cover and look at things, we're not just talking about people's realist calculations. There's all sorts of terrible things the United States has done abroad and does abroad that you can make a good realist case for. But we talk about other things. We're concerned about international law. We're concerned about human rights. We're concerned about people having some type of self-determination beyond the interest of surrounding powers. So I've tried to bring those aspects into the conversation. And I don't have a necessarily conspiratorial view of this. But if your argument was Russia is not acting irrationally to do this, they may be acting as a bully towards Ukraine as a whole, although clearly in Crimea there's a lot of support, genuine support for this. Although I think if you ask the Muslim population in Crimea, you'll get different feedback. But that's not just how we look at things on this show. We don't just look at things through a realist perspective because there's a lot of other factors to try to get in. But from a realist perspective, it's completely understandable why Russia has done this. Now, I think what needs to happen is, look, we're not going to fight a war over this, obviously. We need to de-escalate the rhetoric, and we need to figure out both through our mechanisms and our prime mechanisms right now, yes, I think we should be applying pressure to Russia. We need to be applying pressure to the government in Kiev to make sure that there's no nonsense with violating Russian speakers' rights, that there's no nonsense with allowing extreme right-wing politics to dominate, which has not been the case so far. But we need to add that pressure as heavy as everything else. And Ukraine very well may split up. And maybe that was the natural course of events. But I think in general, we do not want that type of application of brute domination and violation of law to be what precipitates those things happening. So anyways, keep watching this. We'll keep debunking the stupid ranting of the neocon wing, but it would be a real mistake to not take into account the real dangerous precedent that Russia set by doing this as well. Just as we set a deeply dangerous precedent by what we did in Iraq, as an example. And it also doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of other areas where there could be overlaps of interest and possibilities of collaboration on other security issues. But that's where things stand now with Ukraine.